My name is Adam Thomas. Good afternoon. I'm the Assistant Director of the James Madison Program in American Ideals and Institutions at Princeton University. It's my pleasure to welcome you today to our 2025 annual Elizabeth M. Whelan Lecture. Before we begin today's program, I've been asked to underscore Princeton's free expression values. Members of the Princeton University community and visitors have broad freedom to express themselves in a manner consistent with the university's policies. At the same time, university policies prohibit conduct that disrupts university operations and activities. To be clear, any individuals who disrupt this event will be asked to leave the room immediately. Failure to leave immediately will be considered a violation of university policy, subject to disciplinary action, as well as defiant trespass under New Jersey law, subject to arrest. Now, to introduce our program. The James Madison Program is dedicated to exploring fundamental questions of Western political philosophy and constitutional law. For those of you who would like to know more about what we do, I invite you to visit our website at jmp.princeton.edu or to follow us on X. Our handle is just Madison Program. On our website, you can sign up for our newsletter, subscribe to our Madison's Notes podcast, and learn more about all our upcoming events, both virtual and in person. Before we begin, I would like to invite Stephen Whelan, a member of our advisory council, to share some words about his late wife, Elizabeth Whelan.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. I am not only a proud alumnus of this distinguished university, but also a proud charter member of the James Madison Program's Advisory Council. You know, if my wife, to whom I was so fortunate to be married for 43 years, if she were still here, she would be delighted for two reasons. Number one, our daughter Christine Whelan graduated from Princeton in the same decade that Brandice did. Number two, in March of last year, she married a Stanford graduate. So she would be doubly happy. Brandice has already been formally introduced, so I'm happy to let you take the microphone and welcome you very much.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
So when I first was asked to give this talk and scheduled it, it was in the summer of last year, and I was kind of doing this, kind of esoteric research on public opinion in universities, and no one was much paying attention. So, I guess it's, so here we are. So I'm going to talk about several things today. I'm going to start by just highlighting briefly some of the markers of success in universities in the United States, where we are. Then I'm going to spend a lot of the talk talking about public opinion on U.S. Higher education. So I mentioned I'm going to present some of these data. I went into the field of the American population to survey them in 2020, when, as far as I could tell, almost no one in academia was surveying the public about higher education, even though public opinion, you could see from some Gallup polls, was declining in terms of public confidence in higher education. So as someone who's done a lot of work on how public opinion and public policies relate to each other in the United States, that seemed not good to me, right? We know that, say, if Social Security were at 35% support, we wouldn't have Social Security the way we have it. So sort of what's going on? Why is this happening? And I'm going to present both some of my own data, but also some others' data that's from organizations like Gallup on this subject, because I think that brings us to where we are today. So often in the media, we sort of start with, January or something that's happening, say, in Massachusetts or Florida. But in fact, public opinion is going to be the context for a lot of what's happening, I'm going to argue. And then we'll talk about some of these political challenges. Well, we're going to talk about both long and short-term political challenges to university, and we are going to get to the elephant in the room, I promise. But I want to sort of first talk about how we got here before we focus on that. And towards the end, I'm going to talk a bit about a comparative and historical perspective of the modern American university. I think this is important because, particularly for those of us who work in universities, but perhaps for some outside of it as well, it seems pretty obvious that we should be the place where scientific inquiry and innovation occurs. But of course, that's not necessarily true from an historical perspective and a comparative perspective. And so we shouldn't simply assume we have a monopoly on those areas. And then I'm going to conclude with some recommendations of what can be done. And in particular, I'm going to be focused on trying to improve public confidence in higher education, but we can also talk a bit, some of those have concrete actions within the university space of what we should be doing. Okay, so at some level, we're the envy of the world, right? So I think this is important because we have something to lose here that's important. 8 of the 10 universities that have the most Nobel laureates are in the United States. Lots of other measures. So this is a Reuters measure of innovation in universities. This is based partly on patents and scientific contributions in journals, but you can come up with other measures. The United States looks great in terms of innovations occurring in universities. International enrollment, which is a sign of where you want to be on the cutting edge. Particularly at the graduate level, we're really the leader of international enrollment. We're also the leader at undergraduate enrollment. Again, it's sort of a good sign when people want to come to you rather than leave. So these are all positive markers of where we are. But here's the trend in public opinion I previewed. So this is the Gallup confidence poll, and the reason I was actually originally looking at it when I started to get into the field is they do kind of confidence in lots of institutions. So the presidency, Congress, things that as political scientists are really core to our study. And as I'll show you, other institutions, though not all, and that's important, have experienced declines. But universities were experiencing a pretty quick, and steady declines. You can see that in as recently as 2015, we had close to 60% of the public saying that they had quite a lot or a great deal of confidence in higher education in the United States, and that now is around 36%. That's a big drop. Public opinion doesn't usually move that quickly. And likewise, we go from around only 10% of the public having very little confidence going up to 32%. And I should note that they say very little, none. Gallup tells you that none was not given as an option. People just volunteered that. And so they grouped them in with the very little. So this is really worrisome. And I should note it wasn't as if 2015 was some sort of weird point. Now, we don't have a lot of data from before that, but there are some isolated polls from the 1990s. And in both of those, for whatever reason, the polling, they separated private and public universities, but those had similar levels of confidence, and they look very similar to where confidence was in 2015. So it sort of looks like things were, not overwhelming, not as popular as, say, small business or local government, but pretty popular with the public, and then there's this steady decline. Now, you might say, I think a natural question is it all partisanship? And the answer is no. It is partly partisanship. That's not irrelevant. But Democrats, and these are not, for those political scientists in the room, these are kind of core Democrats. It doesn't include people who say, I lean Democrat, but I'm really independent. Even among core Democrats, confidence in university declines by 10 percentage points over this period. Among independents, it declines by about 15 percentage points, and then of course but we kind of know it takes a large dip, 30 percentage points among Republicans. So obviously the worst with Republicans, but all partisan groups of the major three, including independents, experience a loss of confidence. And you see among independents and Republicans a large increase in those who say very little or none. So again, not good. You might think this is all education level. So you've probably read that there's been a fairly big separation in how people vote now in the United States over since the 1990s, and particularly in the past 15 years. In the kind of college-educated versus the non-college educated and how they vote. It used to be the case that college-educated and higher were voting more Republican. That's no longer the case. It's not a huge difference, but it's a real difference. It's not simply statistical error. And then actually, let me take that back. It is a huge difference and not just statistical error. And likewise, those without a college degree, though, are now voting, and that was kind of, the Democrats are struggling with this, are now voting in more Republican. So it's a natural thing to say, okay, so probably it's that this is all just driven by who has a college degree, and people who go to college tend, and have graduate degrees, they tend to like it. That's less than 50% of the public, so that would still, I think, be quite bad for us, because it would mean that 50% of the public didn't like us, but it would at least be explainable. I promise there's only 2 slides that have these more technical materials. It's too bad Robbie George isn't in the room. I was going to tease him because I know that at the Madison program you can think for yourselves, and Robbie would never tell me I couldn't say what I wanted to say. I don't know how he feels about regression coefficients, but it's only 2 slides, and we'll be done with them after that. But I wanted to, the idea of regression is you can kind of assess which is the stronger predictor. And in this case, we're looking at, well, is it education or is it ideology? In the aggregate population, there's actually no effect of education whatsoever. And that's whether you do it in a more ordinal way of saying, did you not graduate from high school, 2 years of college, 4 years of college, or if you just compare, did you go to college, did you get a 4-year degree or not? Or did you get at least a 2-year degree or not? There's nothing special about how you measure it. And what you see, though, is that how liberal you self-identify as on and this is a 5-point scale, affects a lot. Whether, in this case, this was my own analysis that I went in 2020 with, which was favorability of professors. And I admit this is kind of it's a little bit different than the Gallup measure. It's basically what I could get funding for. There was a lot of funding, and I'll show you in a moment how professors compare to other groups. There was a lot of funding at that moment in 2020 for views of the police, so I could kind of slip this in with that. How do you feel about professors relative to these police, relative to these other professional groups? And so this is what we see. It's not mainly education. When you divide the groups up by party, we see something similar, although slightly different for Democrats. So for Republicans and independents, it's what we saw before, that it's how liberal you are that affects your favorability of professors. The more liberal you are, the more you like professors. Whether you went to college or not doesn't matter. And if anything, for Republicans, although it's not what we call statistically significant, there's a slightly negative effect. It's as if you go, the more educated you are, the less favorable you are to professors as a Republican. I'm going into the field now. I just got IRB approval this week. I want to collect a much bigger sample. This is about 1,000 people total, but I want to be able to collect about 1,000 from each group to see if some of that, effect is even more significant. For Democrats, we do find that more highly educated Democrats do like professors better. So, but it's not a huge effect. But even for Democrats, among Democrats, of course, there's variation in how liberal they say they are. The more liberal you are, the more you like, the more favorable you are to professors as a group. I mentioned here's how we are in comparison to some of the other groups. This is the height of the defund the police movement. So this is the nadir for police in terms of their popularity, and we are 1 percentage point more popular than they are. That's not good. We're 4 percentage points more popular than journalists, and we're significantly less popular than military personnel, nurses, and a host of other professions. So a lot of people would say, so just, there's this chart came out. This actually came out a week or two before I was giving a talk on this topic in the fall, and I was just flabbergasted. So the Chronicle of Education, and you can look this up, they have this sort of don't worry, be happy article. It does before, everything started happening with universities this spring. But it was after a lot of other things that happened to universities. They said, great news. We're only in the 30s. You can see 36% support, but other groups are unpopular too. Look at this. Organized religion, they're at 32%. I mean, I don't know who would look at this and say that's great news. I mean, I was just in shock when I read this article. And again, you can look it up in the Chronicle. But kind of, don't worry, everything's good. So you can see the military, and I should note been on at conferences where the military, that's on kind of trust in institutions, the military is actually very worried about 60% approval, a number of people in the military, because they feel like it's peacetime. I mean, what happens if we go to war and, things start happening and we're only at 60%? So no one would want to be at 36%. And it's also the case that these declines that, the decline I mentioned about education is not equal across institutions. I hear this a lot. This is a more reasonable concern because there has been a decline in many institutions, in fact, including the military, which used to be much higher than 60%, and is one reason they're concerned. But it's also not the case that all institutions have declined equally. And in fact, state and local government are as popular as they've been on average going back to 1970. So people like their local government on the whole, 67% approval, state government 59%. You saw small business there before. So there have been real declines, as you can see, the legislative branch, the judicial branch, but it's not equal, and we shouldn't assume there's nothing we can do about it and that this is just sort of happening. And it could never be changed. Okay, so what do people say they don't like about higher education? This is really important because it gets into, if we're going to change, what would we need to think about? Or at least what are some things we should think about, even if we decide, people are, right, if China, we don't want to do it. Like if China came in to me and said, you have to say everything's perfect about China, you might say, okay, it's not worth it to me. So I get that. But it's worth listening to what people are saying. The number one issue is that universities have become politicized. That's the number one issue that the mass public cites in terms of why they lack confidence in universities. I am going to talk about all three. The second is actually skills preparation for the workplace, and kind of workplace success, and the third one is cost. But first on the political agenda. When you ask people and there are open-ended responses, this can be grouped into a number of areas. You've got indoctrination, too liberal, politicized, pushing an ideological agenda. There's other language that's used. And it's worth noting that when you just ask people, well, do you think universities lean toward a particular viewpoint? So this is people who may like university, may have high confidence, may have low confidence. This isn't just people who lack confidence. Nearly 60% believe colleges lean toward a viewpoint. That's higher among Republicans than Democrats, but even among Democrats, 48% believe they lean toward a viewpoint. And if you believe that, the vast majority believe that's a liberal viewpoint. So that's what the mass public is telling us. We're going to come back to some more on politicization, but first to give the other areas their due. A lot of concern that we do not teach, kind of educational skills and programs for success. I'll talk a bit. This is one where we're not, we need to prepare people for the long term and not just for their kind of job right out of university, but we're going to also want to listen and think about how that's affecting public confidence in us. And then cost, which we'll also talk about what might be done there, is cited third, but and there's a pretty big drop between these three and the next group of issues I should know. There's 5% of the public too much focus on sports or something, but these are kind of small. The rest are kind of smaller percentages. These are the big three, and you see the expense of it, loans and debt. And this is just one survey. New America's done a lot of really interesting work on this cost issue. And New America is actually run by Anne Marie Slaughter, who used to be the dean here, so I'll give her a shout out. They don't do a lot on this politicization issue. As far as I can tell, they don't do anything, but they have done a deep dive on cost. This is just one of their many measures. And you can see that when you ask people, it's not the case that individuals in the United States think that most people could get a high-quality education beyond high school that's affordable. Now, what does affordable mean? We can debate that, but that's the third factor. And sometimes you see, claims like it's all about cost, and so that's just not true. So I want to kind of dispense that, but I also in kind of batting away that it's all about cost, we also want to acknowledge that that's one of the factors of the big three. Okay, so a few pieces of good news before we get back to the bad news and what we should do about it. What does the public think the universities do that's important? So research, science, technology, and how things work is at the top of the list. And then consistent with the concern in some ways about whether we're providing the proper skills for the workforce, developing a skilled workforce is seen as extremely and very important. Number of other factors: developing a well-informed citizenry, operating medical centers. But there are a lot of things that the majority of the public think we do that are very important. So I think that's, some good news. It's not that when you ask people, they don't do anything important. People seem to recognize that we do some important things, even though they're very frustrated with us as a kind of mass public at the moment. The other issue is that while support for science in the scientific community did take a bit of a dip after COVID, unfortunately, we get into COVID, we don't see the post because the General Social Survey, I have no idea why, stops doing it right as it starts to dip. I hope it wasn't a cause and effect, bad news, but it's so recent that even if it's dipping, it can't, hopefully hasn't gone too much further. But relative to universities, support for and trust in science is much higher, and that individuals agree that scientific findings have benefited the country as a whole, and even people like me. So people see this as this is not about science per se at universities, but science is still highly trusted. Again, a little bit of a dip with COVID, but it's not an abysmal situation. Okay, so that's the public opinion background that I want us to now start thinking about where we are politically, because that really, if you study political science, if you look at these things, that is the context in which, governors, presidents, congressional members are walking into this situation, right? So what are our short and long-term political headwinds? We're gonna talk in more detail about some of them, but and I'm sure you'll tell me I'm missing some of them, and that's almost certainly true because there's so many that, so when I gave this talk in the fall, again, you felt a little out there, like, hey, there's these headwinds, and I was giving it to a bunch of academics, and it was as if, hey, we need to we need to be doing more about this internally. Now, of course, instead of kind of, oh, these aren't, you're making a big deal out of nothing, it's hard to put in one slide everything that's happening. So, arguably the biggest issue right now, though some will disagree about which is the biggest, are the federal research grants. And I also put state higher education budgets in there because that's a long-term issue for many state universities. And it's just worth thinking that the pension liabilities, that's not getting a lot of attention now since it's all in the federal government, but state governments have often been a major supporter of state universities, and in many cases they're facing a lot of difficult fiscal challenges. I will say that when I gave the talk to academics, deans from major state universities did not, they nodded a lot at that one. They understood that's a day-to-day issue for many people. The federal research grants are very important, and they're not just important to universities like Princeton, which they certainly are, but they're very important to a wide range of universities across the country that are research institutions. So this is going to hit major universities in purple states, in red states. This is not simply a kind of 10 university hit. There's a lot of talk about the tying of grants to political goals, and I'll just note that that is a real issue. The fact, and we're going to get to the elephant in the room, I do promise, but the fact that the grants are being frozen is quite distinctive right now. However, the fact that grants are being tied to political goals is not new. And so I think that sometimes gets a little missed in the media. So there's the Dear Colleague letter, kind of, which did give universities time to respond, right? So for Title IX changes under the Obama administration, there have been what many would call political goals in the grant application process itself to many of these agencies that you had to take on. Now, these were in a prospective way, right? So you had to, it wasn't the cutting of a current grant or the freezing of a current grant. You as a scholar had time to respond in the grant, to new grant applications. So there is a difference, But this sort of, we've never had politicized money from the university, I mean, it's just kind of, very, very ahistoric. You always want to ascribe ignorance, my dad always told me, ignorance, not nefarious intent, but there's a lot of ignorance from people who are saying that. They may not like these political goals. They may think these political goals are bigger ones. That's a subjective point. That's their right to think that, but it's not new. The process issues are quite distinctive. It's worth noting there's the endowment taxation threat. That is more of a kind of wealthy university issue. But right now it's at 1.4% of the endowment income with universities that are higher than $500,000 per student. That includes Princeton, that includes my home institution of Stanford. There are proposals to increase that by quite a bit going through Congress. And this is a little similar to the state higher education budgets. I mean, you can say it's a red, politics issue, but actually states like Massachusetts and Connecticut were considering their own university taxes, and those are Democratic state governments, just for financial reasons. There's a lot of money, and they've got all these fiscal pressures, and hey, you've got this big endowment, right? And you're not that popular, right? You're an elite university, you're sending out all these rejection letters, you're not that well liked, we're gonna come after you. So that's a serious threat for a set of universities. There are a huge number of government regulations going on, and a lot of these are occurring in a very politically polarized environment. The visa issue right now is very large, and one that a lot of scientists in particular, but also even in fields like political science, where a lot of our PhD students may come from, all over the world, is a major issue. I already mentioned Title IX. I mean, if you haven't followed that, that just seems to flip-flop now. It's one of these things where every administration has the new set of Title IX regulations, and you have to change everything if you want to keep your grants. In red states, there have been these attempts to limit what faculty can teach in the classroom, often in response to this sense that universities have moved to the progressive left. But obviously, these divisive concepts laws are themselves an attack on academic freedom to say that certain topics at universities can't be taught. And Trump has even breathed, the topic of possibly tax exemption being on the table. And that's not to mention the kind of continuous congressional investigations. So those are the headwinds. Some of these are very short term, it seems. But some of these are quite long-term, given the public opinion, and I would add the kind of fiscal needs of the country, which are going to kind of come to a conflict at one point or another. So just on the fiscal point, it's worth noting that, even before the Trump administration, grants were going down slightly, from kind of a high in real dollars. And that's just, there was a lot of inflation, so you could say things looked good, but given inflation, they were actually going down in constant dollars. Actually went up in the first Trump administration, and it was under Biden that they started going down. Again, not in a huge way, but it kind of emphasizes the main political point, which is that these fiscal pressures are quite real, and they're going to get more extreme over time as on some of these mandatory payments like Social Security and Medicare, and at the state level on the pensions. So we need to really up our public confidence level. This is just a chart of kind of where universities get their research and development funding, and as you can, where university R&D funding by source. And you can see that the federal government's just a massive source. Universities do collect, raise some on their own, particularly private universities, but if you've been reading the news about Harvard, even the wealthiest universities are gathering a lot of their money from, in terms of research, from the federal government. Okay, last kind of where we are slide on the spring grant activity. So I mentioned this as the kind of one of the major threats. So this is where we are. These are leaks on the kind of budget proposals, but they seem, leaks in credible news sources. which is that there's a proposed cut by 44% for next year at the National Institutes of Health. You've probably heard about the indirect cost rate reduction to 15%. So, typically when you get a grant at a university like Princeton, you have the official kind of direct cost amount, and then there's this indirect cost for things that aren't covered in the direct cost. So, for every $100, you're getting, if the rate is 50%, an extra $50. It's been said that many nonprofits have these lower indirect cost rates, and that's true. It's also true that many nonprofits allow more of the grant to be in the direct cost proposal. So this is kind of a big deal financially, as you might imagine, to universities, and not only universities with medical centers, although certainly those especially. But many NIH grants do not go, not all NIH grants go to medical centers. There's a lot of grant pauses. There's a lot of uncertainty. With the NIH, they paused a lot of grants, but then let them keep going. So that's why I note now there's just more uncertainty. The NSF has been the big action in the past few days, where they've frozen new grants, and there's been some cancellation for activities that are not aligned with agency priorities. Some of those will probably follow the direction of the NIH and get unfrozen, but it's a pretty chaotic environment. And those are just the two big two, but they're, DOE, Department of Defense. I know that Princeton's in a lawsuit now with the involving the DOE grants. There are stop work orders, there are reduced payments. And these are the things that are affecting kind of everyone. I mean, Harvard gets a lot of the news, Princeton gets in the news some, but like University of Nevada, Reno, I mean, they're affected by the 15% indirect rate. I looked up University of Alabama because I thought, okay, let's kind of be a good political scientist and assume this kind of falls where the red state Senate, senators have their indirect costs. I mean, they're at over 40%. So this is a real hit to these red state universities. So, okay. I mentioned, because I think there's this perspective, well, I mean, it kind of, it has to go back to the way it was, and I want to think that. So I really hope that what happens is that, at some point someone says, Brandice, you got really worked up about public opinion and everything was just fine. You didn't need to, that was kind of you being concerned about it, and universities, it all worked out well. But it's just worth noting that, universities didn't always look like they do today by a long shot in the United States or around the world. So I like to think of there being three main periods and types of university kind of formation in the United States. So we've got the early ones like Princeton, which were primarily institutions. I'm tempted to ask, but I'll just, it's not a class. So, we were Presbyterian here. Harvard was Congregationalist. UVA, University of Virginia, was a big exception because that was not religious, but almost every university at the founding period was a religious university with a heavy focus on the liberal arts. So you had to learn Greek, in Princeton, for instance. Then we have the Morrill Land Grant Acts of 1862, where the federal government gives grants land to states to establish, primarily state. They're not all. MIT is actually a land grant university. Most people in Cornell don't know that, but primarily state universities like I don't know if there's any Badgers in here from Wisconsin. Okay. Good.
My daughter.
Oh, good, okay. So yeah, so Madison's one of the most renowned ones, but there are many others as well. And these originally had a focus on the practical arts, including agriculture, right? So universities like Cornell still have a great agriculture school. And then there's the industrialist and philanthropically founded universities, which come in the late 1800s and early 1900s. That's my current institution, Stanford, with the beautiful palm trees, which are not, it turns out, if you don't, they're not indigenous. Just wasn't as nice of a photo, but those came in later to kind of look more Californian, but they're not really Northern Californian palms. But those they were a little distinctive, a little more like the land-grant universities actually, but much more of a focus on technology in addition to the liberal arts and engineering. So this is a period where US universities are not at a peer with European ones, and particularly not with the German universities, but also not with Oxford and Cambridge. Although, just as a, for those who are interested in university history, we're actually producing a lot more engineers than a lot of those countries. So we're producing more engineers than Germany. So we always, because of the way some of these, so Stanford, Carnegie Mellon, Duke is actually more of a medical university. They're coming in with these philanthropically founded ones with a kind of different focus than the original kind of liberal arts focus. Then three major things put us at the top of the world, and give us this envy of the world that the talk started with. So the first is that the Nazis take power, and one of the first things they do is they remove all Jewish academics and anti-Nazi academics from the universities. It's part of removing them from government in general, and since the universities are government, but this has a massive effect on emigration out by academics. And this is when Princeton, of course, gathers people such as at the Institute for Advanced Study, Einstein and von Neumann, many others. This is when American universities make their move, right? And they get many of the top academics from Europe, right? And there's also, even in non-German universities, there's a lot of chaos in Europe and other countries, right? So coming to the US has its advantages as well. Then the second big phenomena is the GI Bill, the Servicemen's Readjustment Act, where the government grants tuition, books, counseling, living stipend to World War II veterans in gratitude for their service. And suddenly 8 million World War II vets take this up before the bill expires. This is a massive influx of students to US universities. And so, and of course, many of those individuals, most of them, when their own kids then are growing up, they're going to send their kids to universities. So this is a sea change in who attends universities in the United States. And then very relevant to the debates now about grants and funding, Vannevar Bush publishes The Endless Science, The Endless Frontier, and in response to the Cold War, that the United States government, as a security matter, needs to invest heavily in cutting-edge research in areas including defense, but also with the founding of the NIH, NSF, and the Atomic Energy Commission. This is really when those agencies take off. And so by the end of, 1955, things start to look a lot like they've looked. And that's why you could see for the past 75 years. So it sort of starts to seem like, well, it just has to keep going for the past 80 years. I mean, this is just the way it is. But this is actually, arguably, some people, anyways, we can debate which of the three was the most important, but this is not at all preordained in 1920. It's not at all clear that the United States is going to be at the top. And universities have a lot of advantages in terms of whether we should be the source of major inquiry and innovation. We're going to be able to conduct science that may not be profitable in the short term, right? So I'll have some pictures later, but major innovations, AI. Stanford likes to talk about how AI was developed at Stanford many decades ago when we didn't have the computing power, right? But the basic science was conducted at Stanford. The MRI machine, that goes on and on. There are many things that aren't profitable in the short term that start at universities. We're also better, have a better capacity than industry to grapple with externalities and the ethical dimensions. That's something we should probably, I know the James Madison program is very involved in these sorts of programs, but probably something that we need to do a better job publicizing and perhaps even doing. We have a lot of scientific and intellectual innovation from synergies across faculty and different divisions that, of course, relates to dealing with these ethical dimensions of scientific innovation. I didn't show you because I knew I was bombarding you with lots of public opinion polls. When people do not like science, what they don't like is they think that often scientists don't think about the ethical implications of their work and how it may create problems in society that they're not considering. So I think that's an area where we as universities can come in and really provide if we'll do it, some value added. And of course, we have a massively superior training, in my view, of course, but I think we have evidence for this, students in terms of more broadly training them and education that combines enduring questions of citizenship, ethics, with more technical training. Ditto, though, one possibility that's a little closer to universities are these institutes, labs, and R&D centers, right? I mean, government could say, well, okay, we're going to fund things, but we think you guys are a bunch of politicized institutions, so we're actually going to take you out. We're not going to give you a lot of money for training students, but we'll fund some research and development. You've sold us that the government needs to be involved in these long-term and security, medical issues. And you don't train students with those, so that is part of our selling point, but people have to believe that they want us doing that. Usually institutes, labs, and R&D centers are focused on a narrow set of fields, right? This is Los Alamos, Lawrence Livermore Lab, and that's the sort of government-funded lab that you'd think about. But from a broad standpoint, that doesn't have to be true, right? That's just been a decision to place it at universities. Okay, so what can be done? Okay, 5 recommendations. So my first recommendation, as you might have guessed from the fact that politicization is the #1 issue that the public cites, is to depoliticize the university. I mean, it's the thing we can do the easiest. If we were, some might say, no, I want you to do the cost. And we do want to do things on cost, and I'll get to that. But we can do this. This is, in my mind, this is an unforced error. We didn't need to do this. I don't think it's benefited us, not just with the public. It hasn't benefited us for truth-taking. And I think it's important, this is a task for university leaders, but this is not only a task for university leaders. Faculty, staff, alumni, students, this is something we all need to take some ownership of, because of course university leaders respond to the university community. So if we assume they're going to do it, but the faculty are really opposed and the staff are, and alumni are opposed, and students are opposed, they're not going to do it. They're going to want to stay in office. So this has to be all of us. And it's just worth noting that it needs to be done, by, both when Republicans politicize, but also when Democrats politicize. So if you only do it and I do say it should not only be done if, some groups only do it when Democrats politicize, that's bad. Since universities tend to lean far left in terms of the faculty and staff political identifications, they tend to push back when Republicans politicize. That's in and of itself good, but the calls are going to ring howl. If people say, well, you don't really care as long as it's politicization in one direction, it's not going to have the same meaning. So we need to start doing it consistently. Okay, so what does this mean in practice? So for university leaders, some of you are probably familiar with the Calvin Report and the Chicago Principles, and those need to be both in policy but also in fact in university life. So they're sometimes on paper, but not on, not in the university culture or enforced appropriately. So the Chicago Principles Princeton have and are for free speech. The Calvin Report is a report also from the University of Chicago, but that advances the concept of institutional neutrality by the institution on matters that are not on core university business. I do think that's an important exception. So this doesn't mean that if the indirect rate is proposed to be 15% and you think that's going to be very problematic for scientific advancement, that you can't take a position on that. You can. That's core business. There's a little bit of, admittedly, a slippery slope with what's core business, but there are some issues that are clearly core business. If you're taking positions on Israel and Gaza and other foreign policy issues, and it's particularly a problem when all of the issues you take positions on, you're to the left, but honestly, I would say even if you're just taking positions, even if they were equally balanced, well, you're going to be seen as a politicized, you're not going to be seen as primarily an educational institution. It's just, there's, and there's going to be a group of the public, particularly on contested issues, that disagree with you. So this is where I think it's an unforced error, and it's a little puzzling. This is not a talk about how did we get here and why. it is the case that since the development of social media, there's been a trend of people kind of, oh, hey, I like that, and I'm for that, and kind of one-line political positions. So I think to many students, and I will say to many of my colleagues even as faculty, it made some sense. That's what you do. You take positions. CEOs should be taking positions. For universities, this is, it's a fraught area because of our role as a truth-seeking institution, and it's a fraught area because we want the public to see us as an educational institution that is truth-seeking. These principles of independence of thought and respect for others' views need to be a core value. I'm soup to nuts, which is, I guess, a British expression. So I learned the British, I guess, end their meals with nuts. So it's sort of, you start the meal with soup, but it's a kind of beginning to end. So this needs to be there in our admission statements. This is not, I actually don't mean, I have the word admissions. I don't want people ideologically selecting students. I actually think that's quite bad. But I think that our admissions materials should note that we are the way we market ourselves, that we are an institution that respects lots of different viewpoints. I think that for people who don't want that, then they need to find another, other universities. If we select in a way and signal that we're not like that in admissions, that will create, a disconnect. New student orientation, this should be a core value that's presented to students from day one. Some of them are coming from high schools and environments where they may not be a core value of a variety of sorts, right? I mean, it could be a very religious institution, it could be a very politicized school, and that this is kind of who we are. And that needs to go throughout, well, I'll talk a minute about it in the classroom, but all the way through honorary degrees and graduation speakers. I could probably have presented data. I mean, if you looked at who's speaking at graduations around the United States, I mean, it's fine to have a mix, but if your ratio at your university is 30-1, and that's the ratio at all the other major universities, you can't be surprised that the public sees the universities as espousing a particular viewpoint. And I will note that on the honorary degrees, it's just a joke among many faculty that the only way you can have an honorary degree as a conservative is if you've given lots and lots of money to the university. Like that's it. There's no other way. And maybe, but even then, you're probably very controversial, and there may be, you probably can't. But, other people, they can get honorary degrees, they're congressional members, Supreme Court justices, but a conservative Supreme Court justice, I mean, that would be really embarrassing to give them an honorary degree. This sends a really strong signal to the public, and I want to say it's not just to your own students and your alumni, it's to the more than 50% of the public that doesn't go to college. That matters in terms of what happens politically to universities. So this is just, this is where it's just sort of, yes, I've tried to fight. I've tried to say, because you could say, well, you've been there. Why haven't you done anything? But, this is why I put this in the university leaders, that this part has to come from them. And I think the university leaders should spend more time with and listening to those with different points of view, both inside and outside the university. We're in the fight for our lives. That's my view right now. And this is the time to start listening and not hollowing up, in the ivory tower to the extent that you haven't been. Because I think there's just a massive disconnect at this point. I don't know why. I was warned that the slideshow that there was some error messages, so I'll just, this was supposed to show up. Earlier, this is the Academic Freedom Alliance. We, some other members of it are in here. Oh, here we go, it's coming in. So this is partly what faculty can do, since it's not just university leaders, faculty need to do their part. We can stand up for each other's rights to state unpopular positions even when we strongly disagree. And the Academic Freedom Alliance, which was founded now around 5 years ago, maybe I have maybe 6, maybe 4, but around that, came into being to stand up for those unpopular views. It's a tough organization to be a part of. I do try to recruit new members, but I do warn them I don't press too hard because basically by the time someone is under attack, they've said something that probably you don't agree with, and that I don't agree with. I mean, that's why and they're probably a really difficult person, because people who are difficult people are the type of people who get attacked, right? So I mean, it's the type of person you really don't want to be colleagues with, and that has said something kind of offensive. But the problem is, if we don't stand up for those people, then for constitutionally protected speech, then we have this issue that the speech that's allowed is in one direction. As faculty, we have to have a classroom atmosphere that welcomes different points of view, encourages respect across students. I know that when I teach, I've added to my syllabus, and I really emphasize on the first day that in some ways, people can be unfair to me. I don't want that. But I mean, if they want to attack me, that's one thing. But if a student says something, you need to take it in the best light possible. You need to not jump to a conclusion about the other student. That to me is the kind of biggest issue. And that part of, students should try to be as respectful of each other as possible. So no one should be a provocateur. That's not the goal. But that part of respect is treating each other in the best light possible and not jumping to these conclusions. And I'll say that I've had I know other faculty who have started adding that to their syllabus who teach in political science. This is an existential issue. We teach on really difficult topics and controversial topics. They've had a lot of success with this. We need to regularly evaluate our own and our department's courses in terms of how they'd appear to an objective observer. I am going to tell one internal Princeton story. I don't mean, I had a great experience in my 18 years here as a faculty member. So we were putting up photos. This was not a class thing, but we're putting up artwork. Well, so I see what the artwork's going to be in my hallway, and it's just one liberal cause after the other. And I said, how would I feel if I was bringing a Republican congressional member down this hallway? I mean, it would look like, or a Republican student, it would just look like, this is what we do. We just espouse liberal goals. And they said, well, you have to choose which picture will go. And I said, well, I'm not, now you're making it seem like I'm anti this or I'm anti that. I said, I'm not anti, any of the pictures can stay. I don't have a problem with any one picture, but I have a problem with 10 photographs, seeming like every liberal cause. Another James Madison faculty member, John Lonergan, he's blunter than I am, and he said, well, why didn't you propose a big rally, a pro-life rally? And I said, John, this is the thing, you're never gonna put that up. And that it's not about what my view is or someone else's views, but it's sort of people are looking like, wait, you wouldn't put that up. But no, I understand universities, we're not gonna put that up. But then that has to do with, if you're putting marches on every liberal cause and you're not gonna put a pro-life cause up, what do you think that says to people in the public? And so, you could put up, anyways, I just note those sorts of things, and on our courses, it can be that individual courses are fine, but if sort of major topics are ignored because everybody's in one slant, we can't be surprised that we have such low public approval. I mean, you just can't. If it's sort of like, well, again, you don't want to cancel someone's, we have to look at why, military history is not being taught. Why, I'll take my own area, like religion and politics. Why are those subjects not taught much now? And take a hard look at ourselves. And then as faculty, we need to take the time to encourage universities to adopt the policies and cultures that promote truth-seeking. I certainly know very well that your incentive is to kind of, do your research, do your teaching, and do it well, and then let someone else do these other things. And that's kind of how we got here. I'm focusing on faculty to take a kind of harder internal look, but staff are really critical to universities. That's actually for undergraduates. They often, outside the classroom, are interacting with staff more than faculty. And so universities need to kind of inculcate this view that further universities as truth-seeking at the highest possible level is a core part of the staff's mission, right? Because if that doesn't happen, and even if everything in the classroom and major topics, military history's back, diplomatic history's back, all this stuff is going, it's gonna have a very different atmosphere. Okay, this is more of this that okay, so recommendations 2 and 3. We need to encourage intellectualism among the students, including on questions that make universities the ideal places to forward innovation. So I mentioned that that's one of our advantages over industry and over labs. So if we don't do that, then I think we're going to have less of a sell to policymakers in DC and state governments and to the public. At Stanford, we now have a first-year curriculum on the big questions. That was instituted in part by Josh Ober, who spent a large part of his career here at Princeton before moving to Stanford, and deserves, a huge amount of credit for helping. There are others who supported it, so it's not only Josh, but he was one of the major leaders on that. That's not going to be for every university. Josh understands that. He's helped launch, and I'm a part of launching that, a national organization that's about the Alliance for Civics in the Academy, that's about bringing back the analysis and thinking about what it means to be a citizen, and as a part of that, thinking about respecting different points of views and debate, and the role of respect for alternative views in society. This isn't, Josh, gets asked a lot, is this Western Civ? I mean, this includes Western civilization, but it is not only Western civilization. This is broader, it's looking at citizenship broadly. It is democratic citizenship. I mean, it's not authoritarian, so in that sense, but it is democratic citizenship outside of Western cultures as well. And much, and modern readings as well. Again, those are two on-the-ground efforts that are ongoing. I'm sure others will have other ideas of how to best implement that. Recommendation 3 is to actually a marketing. This one I think will probably get the, sort of can be done in real time, and maybe the broadest support across the university, which is to literally publicize the advantages of research and inquiry in a university environment. So we don't do a lot of this as universities. So I have the MRI up, I have the e-reader. The e-reader came out of Stanford. The MRI, very contested, for those who know the history, someone who originally believes that they were the original kind of inventor of it didn't win the Nobel Prize, and 2 other people who made further advances won, and he took out a very large ad, I believe it was the New York Times, talking about the scandal of the Nobel Prize. So that's its own history, but no one disputes that it started at universities. That part is not under contention. So most people wouldn't know that, right? So universities could spend money, not a lot of money, but some money, on advertising and letting the broader public, particularly those who didn't go to college, know what we bring to bear and the way in which their health care and their quality of life is affected by us. And these can be cross-university efforts because we're all in this one together. Recommendation 4 is to consider our messages on cost. I'm doing some research on this in real time. I'm doing a bunch of survey experiments about how cost information hits people, right? There's a big difference often between the sticker and the typical price of universities. I do think universities like Stanford, Princeton, I saw Vanderbilt, they're making more of an effort to sort of advertise what is the family with this income and typical assets pay. But if you just look at the tuition price of many universities, it does look out of reach, even if the majority of students who attend the university as undergraduates aren't paying it. And so I think we do need to think about our messaging on cost. I'm very open to reducing costs at university. Obviously, we all like our own departments and our own positions, so it's sort of one of those things where the cuts need to go, need to be elsewhere. But I think that the issues are not just, it's not just about internal savings. I think that, if you're advertising a price of $65,000 and most people are paying $25,000, you need to get that message out there. I mean, that's a really big disconnect between what people perceive and what people are actually paying, and that can be true, and that needs to be adjusted. And I just have a chart at the bottom on these kind of, what are these inflation-adjusted costs of college tuition and fees, and it's high. And that doesn't include the living expenses part. That's just tuition and fees. They actually have come down in real terms just slightly in recent years, but just a massive increase from the 1970s. And again, that's inflation-adjusted, not nominal terms. On the workplace success, this is going to be probably more controversial internally. I'm not advocating for a policy that universities would need to repay the portion of any defaulted loan, although those proposals are out there. But I do believe we should behave as if we would need to do that. A small portion, but we should not be simply ignoring what people are going to college for entirely. I'm a big, I've already mentioned recommendation 2 involves things like a core curriculum, classes on citizenship. So this is not a come to the university, get a very specific degree that gets you a job in X the minute you graduate, and that's all you learn. But, for long-term success in the workplace, the value of kind of long-term capacities and analysis, synthesis, the ability to learn new skills. This isn't discipline specific. This isn't everybody should be in STEM. I don't try to force people in any way or over-recruit them to political science, but I do tell my students in classes, I think political science is a great training for a lot of careers. You really, a lot of jobs involve analyzing big patterns and yet taking on a very specific case and thinking about what's different about that case, as well as incorporating big patterns of information. That's completely what political science is about. I mean, so that's why we see students, and that's in more the business world that I'm thinking. Obviously we train people for law and government and closer related fields. So this is not, everybody should major in computer science. And this isn't even limited to the classroom, right? I mean, career services and advising can be beefed up. But I think to simply dismiss the concerns outright as if, we wouldn't, again, even if we had to pay 2% of any defaulted loan, right, in our minds, that in a good way, universities are trying to bring in, keep expanding who we're bringing in. And we should assume that part of why they're coming is to do better in the workplace. And it's okay to try to deliver, not just, again, short-term, but long-term capacities. Princeton used to require Greek, as I mentioned. There are different requirements now for what we need in the workplace, and it's okay to think about what might be useful. And that's just a kind of constantly reevaluating. Okay, now about the elephant in the room. Okay. Just a few minutes before we open to questions. So this is obviously a defining moment for universities. And the Trump administration, in terms of due process, has, in my view, not been following it. This involves grants and regulations. There does seem to be a reversal of the endless frontier when you look at grant proposals. So with everything that's happening, it's really tempting to see our challenges as caused entirely by one presidential administration. And a faculty member I greatly respect in a very different field than political science, not here, elsewhere, I was speaking to said, well, isn't the goal just to wait this out? And then everything's going to go back to the way it was. And there's no crystal ball here. But we should keep in mind that the Democrats were in power under Biden and had a lot of congressional power, and they didn't undo that endowment tax when they could. I think there was some hope by the universities affected that they would, but they didn't. And even if it were true, and I do not trust the Democrats to undo an endowment tax at all, they have a lot of priorities to spend on. Becoming an institution that does well with only one of the two major parties would be a disastrous decision. I mean, you could say, well, this is just Trump. But it's so tempting if there's bad news on the tariffs, and do you want the headline to be Trump versus Harvard and the lead institutions, or tariff chaos? We don't want to put ourselves in that position. We need to, so I understand in the short term what people are going to be focused on, but we've got to be worried. I hope I've convinced you that there are some serious political headwinds, and that they were there even before the recent administration and the recent political activity. And so we need to start doing things as we're trying to maintain, we don't want to sort of get so focused on the long term that suddenly we're no longer the envy of the world. We don't have any international students. We have no grant funding. I think that is not the advice very much. But that we want to have public opinion at our back. And in some ways, if we could do that, if we were at 56% where we were when Trump was, not in 2015 before he came on the scene, we probably wouldn't be having these problems right now. We have unique advantages for open inquiry and innovation, but we're not a monopoly, and we shouldn't behave like we're necessarily a monopoly, and that some of that couldn't, at least some of it, couldn't go elsewhere. But I do end on an optimistic note. I think the current environment is really challenging, but I do think they're surmountable. And I think if we address the underlying causes, we will be in this position where, hopefully 10 years from now, this looks like a blip, but it's not going to just happen. We as faculty, we as, for the university leadership, but we as alumni who are in this room, and even beyond being an alumni, we as students, but we as citizens who care about universities, I think we have to kind of do our part to address these underlying challenges, and then we'll get there. So thanks for your very strong attention.
Thank you, Brandice, very much. We have time, about 20 minutes for Q&A. I'm sure we have a lot of questions. Please wait for the microphone to reach you before you ask your question. And please limit yourself to a question in order to allow us to get through as many questions as we can. Let's start with Greg Conti over here.
Is there a, well, can I just hold it? This is a little, can I just hold the microphone?
Let him hold it.
I
Let him
don't really
hold it.
understand. That's awkward. Well, good to see you, Brandice. I want to ask about two other headwinds that didn't come up, demographic and technological.
Yeah.
So demographically, there are just fewer kids than there were before. I remember reading, even before COVID happened, a really dark prediction that 1 in 10 American colleges would fold before 2050 or something, just from the demographic decline. And that doesn't seem like something we can just wait out in a presidential administration. And then there's also, I just wondered how you saw technology playing into this. So there's both AI, I mean, is that going to make, what do you think about that? But also, when you think about politicization, it seems to me that without social media, it just wouldn't be as salient an issue. The internet and social media made the partisan skew of the university so much more present to so many more people than it would have been otherwise, and that universities just haven't really adapted to how to behave in an internet age. So what do you think, just kind of open-endedly, about those questions?
I'll take the second one first. So I do think that part of it is not thinking through how to behave in an internet age in a variety of ways. So I think, though I do want to say, there is evidence that universities have become more heavily democratic over time that's independent. So it's not simply publicizing something that was there. Okay, I know you know, but since you asked it, I wanted to just emphasize. So I think part of it is the increasing leftward tilt, but part of it is that now that's so part of when I'm glad for a variety of reasons you asked the question, but one of the things I had meant to say in publicizing both our innovations, because I can get very excited about things like the MRI or e-reader, but we have a lot of great classes going on and a lot of great education going on. But of course, I mentioned in passing, we use these techniques and they go well, but of course that's not in the news. I mean, nobody's talking about, Justin Grimmer had this great class on all these hot topics like immigration, and the students loved it, and people said lots of different viewpoints were respected. We have to do that. I mean, we as universities need to take that on, because what do people on social media want to do? Well, they want to get clicks, and they're going to report isolated incidents. And so actually, I think it's great. The announcement about free speech was made, and we were told, there are free speech coordinators. I said, I think that's great, because actually, the first conference I planned out at Hoover, I talked to the conference planning was going on starting in the summer of, right before October 7th. So I guess the summer of 2023. Is that right, or 2024? it was, anyways, it was, yeah, I guess 2024, so that summer. And so it was before October 7th, so kind of protests and all that weren't on people's mind. And I said, well, let's have a plan for it's Hoover, we're having in 2 governors, we need to have a protest plan in place. Because I said, when you're thinking on the fly, things go really poorly. We got to know exactly what we're going to do if people crowd the room, so that things go smoothly in real time, and that the governors get to speak. Because we had a Democratic and a Republican governor speaking, and I said, who knows who they're going to be? What they're going to be? Who knows what the governor did last week that they're going to be protesting? And people kind of thought I was a little crazy, maybe not crazy, but a little hyper worried, a little overthinking things and anxious. Of course, by the time we had the conference, it was after October 7th. But I think it's great that Princeton's trying to be prepared. You don't know where, people are trying to get on the internet. That was my point. Like, we're having high profile people who could be potential future presidents, so it could have nothing to do with us. And I do think universities have been slow. I mean, I would agree with that people are looking for clickbait, and we need to both be prepared for that to try to preempt that, and we need to publicize all the great things we're doing, because particularly people who don't attend universities, why would we think they'd know about it? We're not telling them.
Other questions? Please, in the back.
Thanks for an incredibly practical presentation. I really love that. I have a question. I get your point on having broad viewpoints, but at some point, in some instances, some of those viewpoints cross from fact to viewpoint. And I'm wondering if there's a line that you draw where fact is fact and viewpoint is viewpoint, or if you leave that blended.
So there's constitutionally protected speech and there's not that's a kind of separate maybe discussion, but it is worth noting. No one's in a classroom. You're allowed to have fact-based, so I definitely don't think it's okay to say this is, you could express opinions, but facts are facts. So the idea of allowing, but there are going to be different opinions about some sets of facts, about particularly if you take the subject I teach about what policy should be enacted. So you're not allowed to pretend something's true that's not true and get a good grade on it and have students say that's right, and have faculty say that's right. But I guess I thought where you were going to go, but maybe that's not where you're going to go, is that some viewpoints can be offensive. And I think it's okay for people to take offense. That's okay. We don't have to say that, oh, I like that viewpoint and it's equal. That's a little different than saying, if you issue that viewpoint, we're going to try to get you thrown out of the university. We can be offended. You certainly can't state things that aren't true. That's not okay. And actually, I will say that since I'm part of the Academic Freedom Alliance, I've been on the side of we can't let people say things that either their job prohibits them, student information that would be, you have to be a professional. And also we wouldn't want to protect someone who's saying something that just simply is academically untrue. I mean, you're a physics professor. You can't just say something that physicists know isn't true. That's not what we're designed to do. And I've kind of tried to remind people of that.
In the front, please.
I'm curious what you think about the transparency aspect of universities today, given what's happened in Washington in terms of transparency, and just putting light on the fact that universities are getting enormous amounts of money. And in fact, Harvard at $9 billion apparently is 1/3 of their operating budget. What can universities do to look at themselves inwardly and say, do we really need all these studies to be done? Is this really reasonable for us to have 40% of all this administrative cost being taken out of an NHI fund et cetera, because I think that's a real issue for people to come to grips with how spoiled universities have been in general.
Yeah, so on the grants, I would note that many, I sort of, and I'm going to probably get pushback from colleagues on this, but I'll it is my view, and they can tell me they disagree. So there are a lot of things, I mentioned this in passing, that can't go in the direct costs of grant proposals, and I think are reasonable. And again, I was told directly, I won't mention, but by a colleague at Yale, I completely agree with you. By a colleague, I mean a kind of field-wide colleague. He said, I completely disagree. I said, like one thing universities could do is kind of talk to the government, should more of the grant be in the direct costs? If these are sort of heating and cooling costs in laboratories, I mean, maybe, or other types of direct administrative costs about that type of medical research, maybe we're at a point with trust in universities and that, yeah, it's a little inconvenient to put, it's a lot more kind of small numbers that add up, but maybe we're kind of at that point. And I would personally be okay. And I will say that political science is not going to be a big benefit. I don't think we're getting a lot of money. We're not one of the wealthiest departments on campus or anything like that. But we're probably not a big beneficiary of it, but I think that would be a reasonable conversation to have. So I'll just note there's reform that isn't completely, that sort of says, yeah, hey, like we've lost your trust and maybe some things need to change. I'll also note, and again, I'll probably get pushback from some colleagues, but like I've always been a little confused why some universities have 69% and some have 55%. Now, people don't really have 15%, so I think that's just worth noting because there's so much that's not supposed to go in the direct cost. But I've always been like, well, some people would say, oh, it's because, Harvard, they have all these great libraries or something. I'm like, yeah, but I mean, if you're UC Davis, why don't you want, I've always, now again, the Yale colleague gave me a lot of pushback. I think Yale's rate must be very high because otherwise I wouldn't be getting that pushback. But you could reform it without throwing the baby out with the bathwater. I do think universities need to make the case, and that will involve some greater transparency that shows value. And that, again, could be direct costs. I'll also note that I think universities should move, kind of one of my practical, I didn't want my slides too crowded. Universities are moving towards open access, which is allowing all their articles to be just, in some ways, if you're getting government funding, again, this has always been, it's a little like the 69% versus 49%. I've never understood that. I've never understood why we would be getting government money and then the public doesn't have access to the articles. A lot of them aren't going to be of mass, in the sense that they're very highly technical, but it would still show what we're doing, right? So I know that probably doesn't fully match you, but I do think some soul searching and some making the, having to make the case for ourselves is warranted.
Please, in the blue shirt here, second row.
Thank you. First off, I happen to have liked your charts, so
thank you.
You're quite welcome. Does freedom of speech cover disruption of lectures?
Freedom of speech does not cover, in my again, so there's time, place, and manner restrictions that are constitutionally allowed. And that's not just true for private universities where it's even clearer, but even public universities, there can be time, place, and manner restrictions. And I think what universities need to do a much better job of is enforcing those, consistently, right? So I personally don't want a chaotic university. I would like a university where you can't disrupt the lectures, where at some level, university, like a private university could decide, right? Like we're gonna have a really chaotic environment and it's gonna be chaotic for everyone. It's gonna be chaotic if it's a group on the right disrupting. In practice, I think the public perception is that, disruptions from the progressive left are treated differently than other types of potential, or actual disruptions. And so, that's really bad. But the short answer is you can definitely protect, you can definitely enforce time, place, and manner.
Yes, in the middle here.
I appreciate the totality of your presentation. In the beginning, you talked about curriculum, like the great ideas
Yeah.
and citizenship. What if we did a better, instead of messaging, the university conducted itself with open debate, like debate societies of old, where we taught and modeled for students two sides of an issue presented by very learned presenters, but we learn how to listen and absorb debate and make our minds up for ourselves. Why are we not promoting civil debate like Wig Clio
Yeah.
on campus?
Oh, I mean, you're preaching to the choir. And I will say Stanford has recently started a program, I think it's called E Pluribus, along those lines. I completely agree. In my own classes, I assign student roles. So they know when they start, so I was teaching the presidency last spring. You're going to be randomly assigned. You may be assigned to Team Trump in this, policy. You're going to be, it was Biden at the time because Biden hadn't dropped out. You're going to, whatever your views are. So I know you're talking about kind of more broadly outside the classroom. I think that's really important. And I'll also just note a Princeton specific story that happened. So when I was here, I started a program. Fabulous students, as you know, the Princeton undergrads are terrific. These were for students who might have wanted to do a PhD in political science, so they were able, in the field of American politics, so they could come to the research seminars. So they were kind of allowed, because they weren't, the research seminars are kind of smaller classroom seminars, and they could just get a sense of what it's like. And a number of the students told me, and it really struck me, that what they loved the most was seeing how the faculty sort of critiqued each other and then pushed back, right? Because in an academic talk, often you're constantly interrupted and people try to poke holes, you didn't control for this, you didn't do this. And then the person presenting kind of fights back and says, no, this is why what I did was great. But what I honestly felt a little sad because it kind of hit me. Like, whoa, I mean, yeah, our talks are good and everything, but it was as if they hadn't really experienced that very much on campus. And I think that is really important, and universities should be doing much more of that. Not just on research, although that too, but on kind of the big ideas.
Other questions? We have time for a few more. Yes, ma'am, in the back.
So I would like for you to expand on the second question that was asked, because I don't feel that I got a full answer. This woman asked if you have a line that you would draw, even though we want to be respectful of different views, and you wanted to be very respectful of different views, but it sort of reminds me of Trump saying that there are very fine people on both sides when he was talking about Charlottesville in 2024 with the white nationalists. It seems to me, so I'm asking you if you think universities can accomplish this, that I want universities to be leaders of values and ethics and not be leaders of clickbait, not to worry about, well, we won't get funding, or kids won't come to our university because we're not letting everybody say anything. It's sort of like, what would you say, how would you advise the universities in Europe in 1939, what should they do? So I don't know if we're there yet or not, but it sort of feels like we've opened that door. Can you advise me?
So, I think that we need to be respectful of different viewpoints, but as I said, so I'll just start with a class I teach. If you teach on the presidency, people may not like Trump, but if there's a student in the class who supports Trump, we're not going to sort of ostracize the student. That doesn't mean, and they talk about, but admittedly in my classes, I don't really ask students who they support. This is not something I would do. They might offer it at times, but I would consider it rather unprofessional to sort of probe students about their political views. But, we have discussions about, I'm just thinking of kind of a controversial, there's lots of potential controversial topics on the presidency. But, we have a topic about a week on executive orders. So that'll be a really interesting one when I teach it in the fall. And I did teach it to graduate students recently, right? So if a student said, sort of offered unprompted that they liked a particular executive order, whatever I think of the executive, like I think or other students think, we're not going to just kind of, again, we're not really talking about feelings and likes, but students can have different views. Now, if a student said something about an executive order that was simply untrue, they can't say, like you can't just sort of make things up and say this executive order accomplishes X, and it's not doing that. I mean, and if so I understand you're sort of saying, what if a student, you're kind of outside the classroom situation, what if a student doesn't have a view that espouses your values? But your values may or may not be the values, right? Like I want to be a welcoming place, and I'll just say it, like I'm not an evangelical Christian, and I have never been one. I want to be a valuable place. I want to be a place that people of many different faiths can come. 23% of the public or so are evangelical Christians. That doesn't mean that they get to go into my classroom and say things that are not accurate, right? They don't get to do that, right? That's not okay. But they should be able to come into my classroom and provide their sort of, intellectual, whatever is kind of correlated with their intellectual viewpoint. They may wish they were on the Trump team and they may be assigned to the Biden team, and that's like we're randomly assigning. And so I don't want to say, oh, those aren't my values, evangelical Christianity, not welcome here. That's just, I think that's not a truth. It's certainly not a university that's going to be kind of supported, but I actually think that's not our job we're kind of truth seeking, and in some ways, yes, we want to deal with the big ethical questions, and I'm enough of a believer that will lead people to important insights on these big ethical questions and enduring ones that go back to ancient Greece and continue to today.
We have time for one more quick question. You, ma'am?
Thank you for that explanation, but when it comes to more applied sciences, I understand, you said this, physicists should not debate on the, let's say, first law of thermodynamics. We're not debating, fine. When it comes to, for example, teaching sustainability, I'm not even talking about climate change mitigation, but if I say sustainability, as you know, the environmental sustainability, economic sustainability, and social justice, they are so interdependent and interrelated. So there are facts, there are databases, and they are being shut down. When it comes to energy and environment, we are so worried. I'm not talking about medical sciences.
No, I agree. No, look, so, I mentioned DOE. It's up there.
How to handle?
Yeah, no, we're in agreement. We want to be on the leading edge of sciences. That was an earlier slide. I mean, DOE isn't as much money as, NIH. So from the big university perspective, NIH and NSF, but DOE is, as you said, very much in the crosshairs right now. I'm in favor of the United States maintaining that position as the leader in patents, and I think universities have a big part of that. And I do think we have to do a better job, as I said, of selling the public and selling the politicians and making the case for ourselves. But I'm not looking for a world where things go, it turns out you were right back in 2020 when you did these surveys, and now, if only we'd listened to you. I don't want that to be the case. I think that we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater here, and part of that's on others, but part of that's on us to help to do what we can to sell that case.
Thanks very much, Brandice. At 6 o'clock, we have to close.